Well, on to our next Ninja Turtle, aka High Renaissance superstar. Michelangelo lived to a ripe old age, and as a result he complicates our planning, since his later work really belongs to the Catholic Counter-Reformation, or reaction to the Protestant Reformation. So I'll return to his dark Sistine Chapel Last Judgment when we get to mannerism in Unit 9. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo was an artist who not only reflected but also transformed his times. Indeed, he's the first Western artist whose biography was published while he was still living. He was also the first artist whose art made him, in modern terms, a multimillionaire. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo's roots lie in the early Renaissance, and more specifically in the Florence of Lorenzo de' Medici. He was born in a town near Florence and apprenticed to Ghirlandaio. Remember the other Last Supper we just saw? Lorenzo de' Medici recognized Michelangelo's talent, invited him to join the art academy that Cosimo had founded, the first permanent painting school in history, and even invited Michelangelo to live in the Medici palace. When Savonarola's followers succeeded in banishing the Medici from Florence, Michelangelo traveled to Venice, Bologna, and finally to Rome, where he arrived at the age of 21 and would work for much of his life. So this is a good point to pause in my biography to talk a little more about the Eternal Cities revival. During the medieval period, Rome was a one-industry town. The industry was the church, and most of the consumers were pilgrims. When the popes decamped to Avignon during much of the 14th century, Rome went into a steep decline. When the papacy returned permanently to Rome in the 15th century, a series of strong, if not entirely spiritual, popes led a drive to rebuild the city, and especially its religious buildings. These popes were heavily influenced by the Renaissance. The pope we'll be talking about today and next class the most is Julius II, who was pope from 1503 to 1513. He took this name to show his admiration of Julius Caesar, not a notable Christian saint. The drive to beautify and glorify Rome would acquire new urgency when Martin Luther began to challenge church authority, although ironically, the crisis that provoked the Protestant Reformation was German objections to papal efforts to raise money to rebuild St. Peter's by selling indulgences, another example of art allegedly or possibly destroying culture. Anyway, I'll talk about this in my final lecture for this unit. The College Board did not include any Michelangelo sculptures on its list, even though Michelangelo himself preferred sculpture to painting and really considered himself primarily a sculptor. As we'll see, his Sistine Chapel paintings, which are our required work, sometimes look a lot like sculptures. This Pietà is my personal favorite among Michelangelo's sculptures, and the only work that Michelangelo actually signed. It was this sculpture that catapulted Michelangelo to fame and attracted the interest of Julius II. Michelangelo returned to Florence, where he produced his iconic David. This statue is 16.5 feet tall without the base. Like the Pietà, the David was instantly hailed as a masterpiece. In fact, the Florence Cathedral authorities convened a committee that included Botticelli, Filippino Lippi, do you remember the naughty angel, was painted by his father, and Leonardo da Vinci, all to decide where the statue should be placed. Leonardo, according to historical sources, wanted to put Michelangelo's David in an obscure corner. He was apparently jealous of Michelangelo, who in turn, not entirely unfairly, accused Leonardo of not being able to finish any of his great ideas. Leonardo lost this fight, and the committee ultimately chose a spot beyond the main entrance to the Piazza della Signoria, or Town Hall, where it stood until 1873. In that year it was removed to a museum for safekeeping. Michelangelo's David isn't on the list either, but it shows up in several College Board practice questions for the new curriculum. Go figure. Michelangelo would have been very familiar with Donatello's work, which was produced 60 years earlier. So how has he departed from Donatello's vision? Well, Michelangelo's David is obviously much larger. As I mentioned, it's really colossal in size. Both Davids are nude, but Michelangelo's sculpture did not provoke the same unease as Botticelli's. That may be partly because Florence had grown more accustomed to nudity, but it also seems to me that Michelangelo's somewhat older, mature David has none of the disturbing pedophiliac undertones that one might see in Donatello's work. The stance is superficially similar, but Michelangelo is chosen a very different moment in the narrative. not the moment of victory, but the moment when David winds up to fire his slingshot. Note how one side of his body remains closed and relaxed, while the other is poised and tensed and ready to spring. The body stands in a resilient curve like a strung bowstring. The hands and feet are oversized, which renders them more protective and more expressive. Remember, too, that this statue was designed to be seen from below, and Michelangelo designed his David to focus our eye on the two elements of his victory, the head that came up with the plan and the hand that executed the plan. A brilliant brain directing a fit and agile body. This is the Renaissance ideal, and we're going to see it in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel paintings as well. And this brings us to the great drama of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo left behind a detailed autobiography, so we have a blow-by-blow account of his love-hate relationship with his most famous patron, told, of course, from Michelangelo's somewhat self-serving perspective. This video clip introduces the famous partnership and the feud. The video, by the way, starts up after Julius II had canceled Michelangelo's contract to design a gigantic tomb for him, and Michelangelo had taken most of the money that he was supposed to return and run off to Florence with it. The Sistine Chapel is the private chapel of the Pope, located between the papal apartments and the Basilica of St. Peter's. It is here that the College of Cardinals meets to elect a new pope. The chapel was built by Pope Sixtus IV, hence the term Sistine, in the late 15th century, but the original ceiling was simply blue with stars. The lower walls were decorated by a series of mostly Florentine artists. The end wall, which we see here, the Last Judgment, was also painted by Michelangelo much later, between 1535 and 1541. And again, I'm going to discuss this work in more detail when we get to Mannerist art at the beginning of the next unit. Walking toward the altar, one passes from the life of Noah to the life of Adam to the creation of the world, a reverse sequence from the chronological one presented in Scripture. The priest standing at the altar would, of course, see it all in the correct direction, but upside down. Either way, this compositional plan ensured that the expulsion from the garden falls directly above the gate that separates the laities and the priest sections of the chapel. The creation falls directly above the altar. On the curved sides, in those triangles, Michelangelo painted Sibyls, prophets, and ancestors of Christ. Everything that looks like architecture, by the way, is an illusion. It's all painting. Michelangelo was terrified by this commission. He hadn't worked in fresco since he trained as a teenage apprentice 20 years earlier. The Pope, moreover, had suggested that he paint scenes from the New Testament. Michelangelo thought that the Pope's plans lacked drama, and he persuaded Julius II to cover the ceiling with Old Testament narratives instead, from creation through the flood and Noah's Ark. The technical challenges were enormous. Painting on wet plaster requires an artist to work quickly and accurately. It's difficult to gain a good sense of perspective working on a ceiling, although, contrary to legend, Michelangelo stood rather than lay on his scaffolding. His diaries report 4 years of constant back pain. The next video clip talks about the problems Michelangelo ran into designing and then producing his first panel, the Flood, which, as it happens, is the panel the College Board chose as its required work. Okay, I admit that I and many other art history teachers are puzzled by the College Board's decision to choose this as the one required panel from the Genesis scenes. As you just saw, the Flood was the first panel Michelangelo painted on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And as far as I can tell, art historians pretty much agree that it was Michelangelo's worst panel as well. So what is the problem with the composition? Mostly it was just too busy and too hard to see way up on the ceiling. Let's compare it for a moment with the creation of Adam, which is widely viewed as the masterpiece among the Genesis panels. What differences do you observe? Well, the creation panel is much simpler, but it's also more dynamic. The figures are large enough that we can make out some facial expression even standing below the ceiling. And we can also make out the beautifully modeled musculature. Somehow the creation panel also seems to capture the Renaissance enterprise. Humans empowered to think, to create, and of course to sin and fall. God is the instrument of this human power, but man is God's creation and in some ways his partner as well. Here again, as with his David, Michelangelo is all about the action that is about to happen and our anticipation that Adam's new life will begin in just a moment. In the flood panel, I think the male nudes or ignudi on the frame below the flood almost overpower the biblical story. They just too easily draw our eye. But now that I've enjoyed a rare opportunity to diss Michelangelo, I'd like to try and see some of the strengths of this work. Here again we detect Michelangelo's humanist agenda. He has not portrayed the soon-to-be drowned as evil caricatures. These are real people. They're pleading for help, they're assisting each other, they're seeking shelter, and they are hoping somehow for a rescue that we know will not come. Here we see a mother cradling a baby and trying to protect her child from the rain. A man carrying his wife, he hopes to safety. A boy climbing a tree. But of course the only hope lies with that odd, boxy ark at the back of the painting. So what is going to happen to the people raising a ladder to get in? Are they members of Noah's family? Will the ladder be pushed back as the ark sails? There's a lot of drama here. Our second required image from the Sistine Chapel is one of the Sibyls, which Michelangelo placed alongside the prophets because these Greek mythological seers were also thought to have foretold the birth of Christ. Again, we see the marriage of classical and Christian themes that is so characteristic of Michelangelo and the Renaissance, and indeed is so beloved of Julius II. We'll talk more about this when we get to the School of Athens. The Delphic Sibyl is the youngest and most beautiful of the Sibyls. She is presided over the temple of Apollo in the Greek town of Delphi, where it was long customary for the priestess, or Pythia as she was called, to be a young woman selected from some family of poor country people. The Sibyl is carefully, really sculpturally composed. To achieve balance in space, Michelangelo makes the Sibyl turn her limbs in one direction and the face and gaze in a countering direction. While her lower body is mostly static, her upper body twists in a broad, sweeping, arching motion, echoed by the open scroll and the swollen cloak. Michelangelo uses strong color contrast to draw our eye toward her twisting shoulder, while chiaroscuro and Trompe d'oeil architectural features enhance the sense of volume. Presumably, the prophetic scroll she's reading predicts the coming of Christ, so why doesn't she look happier about it? I don't know. Maybe it's because the reign of Apollo is coming to an end. However, there are other pictures of the same Sibyl carrying a crown of thorns, showing that she predicted the sufferings of Christ. Perhaps that's the meaning of the sorrowful expression in those wide eyes. So what do you notice about Michelangelo's women? I think it looks like they're trying out for women's pro wrestling, myself. Or maybe ingesting some controlled substances. Really, all of Michelangelo's figures look a little like statues, and he used male models for both men and women. The Sibyl actually showed up in last year's, that is the 2018 exam. So here's the actual essay question. And I am not, this time, going to talk through the answers. I'm hoping you'll have time to have that discussion in class. You may not. Either way, I am posting the scoring guidelines and the sample student responses with scoring commentary on Moodle. I'd really encourage you to take a look.